When Prince William arrived at Ravensmeir Estate that morning, nobody knew that an old family dispute was about to change completely. William was carrying an old leather folder. It had the crest of the Queen Mother on it. Two solicitors were with him, carrying black document cases. But the biggest question was this: why did William go straight to the old estate office instead of going into the drawing room? Because that was where the old land and property records were kept. And it was there that the story of Ravensmeir began to look very different from what the family had believed for the previous 15 years. Ravensmeir was not an ordinary property. According to the story, the estate included around 12,000 acres of land, a historic manor house, cottages, working farms, a private lake, and several paintings that had never been publicly displayed. For years, Camilla's family believed that the estate would eventually come to them. In fact, the story says that the estate staff had already started treating them like future owners. One room had reportedly begun to be called a family members study. There had been discussions about renovations. Furniture measurements had been taken, and there were even plans to prepare parts of the estate for future family accommodation. But that morning, everything changed. William arrived at around 8:46 in the morning. There was no major public announcement. There was no dramatic confrontation. He went directly to the old office where the estate's historical records were kept. A little later, Camilla learned that William was on the property. At first, she believed he might want to discuss the renovation of the East Wing. But then William presented a legal opinion, and that brought up the question that changed the entire story. Did King Charles actually have the legal right to give Ravensmeir to another family? According to the story, the answer was no. Ravensmeir was reportedly not Charles's personal property. Instead, it was part of an old private family settlement. In this kind of settlement, a property can be protected for a specific family line instead of being treated as the personal property of the person living there. And this is where the most important document appeared. The story refers to an amendment made in 1999 that reportedly set specific rules about the future ownership and succession of the estate. In other words, Charles could live there, maintain the property, and use income connected to it. But according to the story, he could not permanently transfer the estate outside the protected family line. Then came the biggest revelation. The old document reportedly did not carry only the Queen Mother's signature. Princess Margaret had signed it too. According to the story, the amendment was designed to prevent future beneficiaries outside the specified bloodline from gaining permanent ownership or control of the estate. And this was the part that put Camilla's family's 15-year expectations into question. Because if that clause was valid and enforceable, then private assurances from Charles could not automatically create legal ownership. That was why William reportedly made one point clear: assurances are not ownership. The meaning was simple. Giving a family the impression that they will receive a property in the future is not the same as legally making them a beneficiary of that property. But the story did not end there, because the leather folder reportedly contained another important document, a document that was said to carry Charles's own signature. And if that signature was truly an acknowledgement of the settlement, another question had to be asked. Did Charles already know that he could not decide the future of Ravensmeir on his own? That question would make the entire story even more complicated. Because now the issue was not simply who would receive the estate. The issue was whether the promises made over the previous 15 years had ever been legally possible in the first place. And if they were not, why had Camilla's family been treated like future owners for so many years? The situation surrounding Ravensmeir was now becoming clearer, but the real conflict had not started yet. Because if the 1999 settlement really protected the estate for a specific family line, the next question was simple. Was there any way for Camilla's family to use the estate or receive benefits from it? According to the story, this was where the first proposal from Charles's side appeared. The idea was to create a new family trust that would give Camilla's children and future generations a beneficial interest in Ravensmeir. But this proposal reportedly conflicted directly with the 1999 settlement, and William did not accept it. Then a second option was proposed. This one was much more carefully designed. Instead of changing ownership of Ravensmeir, Camilla's family would reportedly receive a 99-year lease for a very small annual rent. On paper, this looked very different. The legal title to the estate would remain inside the family settlement. But in practice, Camilla's family could use the property for decades, so the ownership would stay where it was, while the other family could receive the benefit of using the estate. But there was another old rule. According to the story, the settlement contained a condition regarding long-term leases. Long leases required approval from the trustees, and William was reportedly an important trustee within that structure. Without his approval, this option could not move forward either. The first proposal failed. The second proposal failed too. But then another important sign appeared. Work connected to renovations and preparations at Ravensmeir reportedly began. A residential survey was carried out. Some parts of the property were being considered for future family accommodation. Then records reportedly showed spending connected to furniture and interior work. This was when William's attention to the matter became even more serious, because now this was no longer just about family conversations. If protected estate funds were being used to prepare the property for people who did not have ownership or beneficial rights under the settlement, it would be difficult for a trustee to simply ignore it. That was the point where private promises and legal responsibility came face to face. Camilla's family could argue that they had simply followed what they had been told for years. They had been given the impression that the estate would eventually be available to their family. They had been shown rooms, renovations had been discussed, and they had made plans based on that understanding. But William's position was different. A promise does not create legal ownership, and that distinction became the center of the dispute. For Charles, this could be seen as a family matter. For Camilla's family, it was about an expectation they had built over many years. But for William, it was about the terms of the settlement. And once the matter reached the legal documents, personal relationships became less important than the actual clauses. Then Camilla's family reportedly asked a different question. Instead of arguing about ownership, they asked who would actually inherit Ravensmeir after Charles. At first, the answer seemed obvious. William. But this was where the biggest twist appeared. According to the story, William had already given up his possible claim to the estate, and almost nobody in that meeting knew about it. Not Charles, not Camilla, not her family. That meant William was refusing to allow Camilla's family to take the estate, while at the same time he had apparently stepped away from receiving it himself. So the question became even bigger. If William did not want Ravensmeir for himself, why was he stopping Camilla's family from getting it? That question leads directly to the next part of the story. Because William's decision was not simply about accepting or rejecting an inheritance. It was connected to an older provision in the family settlement, one that could determine who would receive the estate next. And that is where the story of Ravensmeir turns from a family dispute into a much bigger question about succession. The biggest question in the Ravensmeir story was now this. If William did not want the estate for himself, why was he stopping Camilla's family from receiving it? That question became central to the next stage of the meeting, because William's decision was not simply about whether he wanted the property in his own name. According to the story, he had given up his possible claim and, by doing so, activated an older succession mechanism within the family settlement. And that changed the entire situation. The 1999 amendment was reportedly not only about deciding who would receive Ravensmeir after Charles. It also explained what would happen if the next qualified beneficiary gave up their own right. In other words, William's decision could affect the generation that came after him. This is where George, Charlotte, and Louis became important. If the settlement was applied in the way described in the story, then after William stepped aside, The estate could not simply go to someone chosen because of a family relationship or a private promise. Instead, the next qualified beneficiary would be determined according to the rules of the settlement. That is why William giving up his possible claim was so important. At first, it looked strange. But according to the story, William was not trying to keep Ravensmeir for himself. He was trying to make sure that the estate continued according to the original rules of the settlement. But another question immediately followed. If Camilla's family was never supposed to receive the estate, then how had they been treated like future owners for the previous 15 years? This is where the financial records reportedly became important. William's team began reviewing invoices, vendor records, and payments connected to the property. Some expenses were ordinary maintenance costs, but other entries appeared to point toward future occupancy, renovation plans, furniture orders, changes to residential areas, and preparations for parts of the estate to be used as family accommodation. These records created an important difference. The question was no longer simply what someone had promised in private. The question was, who had made real financial commitments based on those promises? A verbal promise can be difficult to prove. Financial records are different. If protected estate funds were being used to prepare the property for people who were not beneficiaries under the settlement, then it could become difficult for a trustee to ignore the situation. That was the point where William's position became much stronger. He was no longer dealing only with a personal disagreement. He also had a formal responsibility, and that made Camilla's family's position even more difficult. They could say that they had simply followed what they had been told for years. From their point of view, they had not suddenly claimed the estate. They had been given the impression that Ravensmeir would eventually become available to their family. But William's response was different. Promises and legal rights are not the same thing. That distinction became the heart of the entire dispute. Charles was dealing with family expectations. Camilla's family was dealing with an expectation they had built over many years. But William was dealing with the terms of the settlement, and once the matter reached the legal documents, the clauses became more important than the personal relationships. Then another major question appeared. Did Charles fully understand the meaning of the document he signed in 1999? It was difficult to know. At that time, Charles was not yet married to Camilla. The future family situation was also very different, and the document reportedly mentioned Ravensmeir among other legal and financial matters that would not have been easy for an ordinary person to understand. So, two possibilities remained. The first was that Charles understood the clause and still hoped it could be changed later. The second was that he signed the document without realizing how important that particular clause would become years later. But either way, there was one thing that remained clear. Later promises could not automatically cancel the old settlement. And this was William's biggest advantage. He was not creating a new rule. He was not creating a new claim. He was simply bringing old documents back into the discussion, a document that reportedly carried Charles's own signature, an amendment that had been in place for years, and a succession clause whose importance had suddenly become much greater. But one major question still remained. If William had given up his own possible claim, who would Ravensmeir actually go to? And was there really no path left for Camilla's family? That was the point where the most important condition in the old settlement was about to become relevant, a condition that could determine who would receive the estate after William and why the real beneficiary of this entire dispute may have been someone whose name had barely been mentioned in the meeting. The Ravensmeir story had now reached its most important point. The question was no longer what Charles had promised, or who expected to receive the estate. The real question was, what did the old family settlement actually say about the future of Ravensmeir? According to the story, when William gave up his possible claim, the next succession provision in the settlement was activated. And this is where the next generation, George, Charlotte, and Louis, became important. The basic purpose of the arrangement was reportedly to prevent the estate from becoming the private property of one individual and to keep it within the specified family line. So William's decision was not about keeping Ravensmeir for himself. It was about making sure the estate continued according to the rules of the settlement. That was also why the proposed 99-year lease was rejected. On paper, ownership would have remained inside the family settlement. But in practice, another family could have used the estate for decades. And according to the story, the old amendment had already included rules designed to prevent this kind of loophole. This was the biggest difference in the entire dispute. Charles was looking for a solution through promises and family arrangements. William was looking at the documents. On one side were years of family relationships and expectations. On the other was the legal structure of the estate. And when the two came into conflict, the old documents became decisive. For Camilla's family, the result was extremely difficult. According to the story, they had not viewed Ravensmeir simply as another property. They had imagined it as their future home. Rooms had been planned, renovations had been discussed, furniture had reportedly been prepared. But if the settlement worked in the way described, none of those preparations could create legal ownership. That is why William reportedly handled the matter through records and legal documents, rather than turning it into a personal confrontation. He did not announce that he was taking the property away from anyone. Instead, he raised a simple question. If someone never had legal title or beneficial ownership, how could that person inherit the estate? That became the central conclusion of the Ravensmeir dispute. But there was another important part of the story. When the amendment was created in 1999, it may have been difficult to imagine that the same document would become so important almost 3 decades later. Charles was not yet married to Camilla. The future family situation was very different. And yet the settlement reportedly contained restrictions about future succession that could apply to circumstances that had not even happened yet. That is why the roles of Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother became so important in this story. If the documents and clauses existed in the way described, then they were not simply dealing with an immediate family situation. They were reportedly creating a structure designed to protect the estate against possible future disputes. And decades later, that same structure became William's strongest argument. Still, there is one important point to remember. Much of this story is presented as being based on private documents, unnamed sources, and alleged legal discussions. Claims like these should be treated carefully unless they can be confirmed through official records and reliable public sources. Private royal estates, trusts, and succession arrangements can involve very complicated legal structures. But within the story being told, the final outcome was clear. The attempts to permanently transfer Ravensmeir to Camilla's family did not move forward. The 99-year lease option also failed. And instead of taking the estate for himself, William reportedly chose to follow the original succession structure of the settlement. So the estate that one family had reportedly viewed as their future for 15 years never became their legal property. And perhaps that is the biggest twist in the entire story. William did not save Ravensmeir for himself. He saved it for the system under which, according to the story, it was never meant to become one person's private property in the first place. An old leather folder, a signature from 1999, a forgotten succession clause, and promises made over many years. Together, they changed the future of Ravensmeir. But one major question still remains. If these documents were so important, why did the family and estate staff appear to have a completely different understanding of the situation for so many years? Was it simply a legal misunderstanding? Or did some people knowingly ignore the old settlement? Perhaps that is the biggest unanswered question in the Ravensmeir story. And until that question is fully answered, Ravensmeir remains more than a royal property dispute. It becomes a story about how, inside royal families, one old document can sometimes carry more power than years of promises.